In today's Sound for Video session, we're going to take a look at the dbx286s. This is a microphone channel strip. Sometimes, well, they call it a mic preamp and processor, but this is basically something you plug a single microphone into. It has a preamp, but it also has several things like a compressor, a de-esser, an enhancer, and an expander gate. I just turned it bypass on right now. What that means is that right now you're hearing just the preamplifier, and all of the rest of things are turned off. So this is just the raw signal. You're hearing everything that you're going to hear in this episode is actually being processed through the DBX. Now, a couple of things. The way the audio signal chain is set up right now, just so you understand where this fits into a workflow, I have my microphone, and it is, in this case, is an AKG C414 XLS. It's a large diaphragm condenser microphone. It's routed into the input, the microphone input on the DBX. It goes, of course, through here. Then that's output to the Apollo X6. This is an audio interface. So this device right here takes an analog input from a microphone or from any other kind of device that produces a audio signal. In this case, we're using a microphone, and it outputs an analog audio signal. And then I have a patch cable in the back on the output of this to the input of the Apollo X6. So this is not doing any sort of digitizing of the audio signal. This Apollo X6 is the one that's doing that, and then it's sending the digital signal to my computer. So that's just a kind of a background to understand what's going on here. So first of all, we have the preamplifier turned on. In this case, I'm using a large diaphragm condenser mic, so it needs phantom power. So I have the phantom power turned on, and I have a high-pass filter turned on, and I have the preamplifier set to 30 dB of gain. Now, before we move on and talk about the processing here, I want to talk about why you would ever want to use something like this. A lot of podcasters use this, and of course, it was used for a long time in the broadcast world, radio. The question is why? Why would you want to use it, and what advantage does it give you? Well, there are pluses and minuses, and it's not for everybody, but I wanted to kind of just run through it for those that are interested in sound and understanding the circumstances where you might use something like this. I think this is really useful for circumstances where you're going to be doing a live stream, or in cases where you want to save yourself some processing time in post. So those are two options where I think this could be a useful tool. Now, I'm not here to suggest that this is the only tool. It is the best way to do things. None of that. But a lot of people seem interested in using something like this to save themselves some time in post, especially podcasters, but I think for voiceover work and things of that nature as well. And actually, there are quite a few voiceover artists that are using this or something like it. So what are the risks? What are the downsides? Well, the downside is if you're recording with something like this, you have baked in the processing. You can't undo that processing in most cases. So once that's sort of baked into the recording, if you didn't do it right, you've just baked in some badness. and that's a circumstance where you really kind of need to do some practice with this first. And honestly, I'm just getting started with this, so hopefully this turns out okay in terms of the settings. But let's just run through how you would set it up if you are interested in using something like this, and in particular, how the dbx286 works. So first of all, I have the bypass on. What I'm going to do is turn all of these other effects off, basically, before we turn off the bypass. So right now you're hearing just the microphone preamplifier, and I'm turning all that down. And I'm going to turn this at the end is the kind of the makeup gain, and I've turned that to 0. Okay, let's turn off the bypass and see what we've got. Okay, the bypass is off, and sounds about the same. That's okay. So first of all, we're going to talk about the compressor a little bit. Now, the idea with the compressor is you can manage the transients or the peaks, the loudest peaks. They're actually not the loudest necessarily, especially if they happen very quickly. They go up and come back down very quickly. They're the largest amplitude, but they don't necessarily sound the loudest unless they sustain. And what we want to do is a lot of times when you're doing some recording, you need to overall boost the levels. But if those peaks are coming close to 0 dB, full scale, you can't push them beyond that. If you do, you just get distortion. And so what a compressor does is it pulls some of those peaks down a little bit, so they're more in line with the rest of the overall spoken word dialogue recording. So there are two settings on this, drive and density. This is a little bit different than you may be used to seeing on other compressors for those that are familiar with compressors. So let's talk about what they each do. First of all, the drive. The drive is a little bit different. So on most compressors, you have a threshold, you have a ratio, you have an attack, and you have a release. Well, this device is actually fairly intelligent and it manages most of those settings for you. But what it does give you is a drive, first of all. So this is instead of a threshold. And in this case, normally what you would do is you would set your threshold. You would tell it how many dB down from 0 you want it to come. And then anytime the audio waveform exceeds that, goes above it, it will start to kick in the compressor and kind of push those peaks down. Well, what happens here instead is the threshold is sort of set, and they don't tell you exactly where it's set, but what you do instead is you drive the audio. That is, you amplify the audio a little bit harder, and so those peaks get taller, and they're more likely to hit the threshold. So that's basically what we do here. So I'm going to start pulling this up, and actually, just so we can hear what it sounds like, I'm going to turn the density for now just to 4. But watch what happens over here. This is the reduction that it's doing. And it starts over here at 3 dB and it goes all the way over to 30 dB. So you'll see it kind of start to tickle these over here as I push the drive. Watch this. So I'm going to keep talking and you can hear that it's getting a lot louder. And actually we're probably clipping, so I need to pull this down. This is our makeup gain here. So I'm driving the audio harder and harder, and you can see now we're kind of making the -3 to -6 dB of attenuation occur here. And as I keep pushing, you can see it's doing it even harder and harder. Wow, getting to be a little bit too much. We're hitting it at 12. So really, I think for most spoken word dialogue, you're probably going to want it somewhere in this range here. We're just doing 3 to 6 dB of reduction overall. And then the density, again, refers to how quickly the compressor lets off. That is to say, it stops compressing. So if you wanted to make it let off really, really quickly, you would turn it actually this way, turn it up, and you can see it kicks off very, very quickly. And then if I turn it this way, you can see as I say something and the compressor applies itself, it takes a while before it turns off. So for spoken word dialogue, I think a lot of times you're going to want to be somewhere maybe in the 4 to 5 range. It depends on your voice, and you have to kind of use your ears to fine-tune it and get it exactly where you want it. So there is the compressor. Next up, we have the de-esser. Now, what is a de-esser? For the sibilant sounds, when you say the letter S, and you're probably hearing plenty of this from my voice right now, I have a relatively sibilant voice. Anytime the letter S, C, and some other sounds that we often make when we're talking, that makes sort of this sizzling sound, and it can be very annoying. And it can be very harsh sounding. So what a de-esser does, it helps pull that down a little bit. And we have 2 settings here. We have a frequency and a threshold. So the frequency, first of all, is basically a high-pass filter. And what that means is that here, for example, I have it set to 4 kilohertz on the spectrum. Anything below 4 kilohertz is not going to be affected by the threshold or by the de-esser when I have it set there. So usually sibilance is going to occur between 4 kilohertz and about 8 kilohertz up to maybe 10 kilohertz. And so as you set that there, that means anything below that will not be affected by the de-esser. So we'll start with 4K. That's probably a pretty good place to start. Then we'll apply the threshold. Okay, she sells seashells by the seashore. Now you can see as I push it pretty hard, the threshold, it starts to sound like I have a lisp. So that's the danger of pushing it too hard. And then as I back off some here, you can see we're still getting some of the S's, but it doesn't sound quite as harsh. So let me just turn that off here for a second. So she sells seashells by the seashore. She sells seashells by the seashore. She sells seashells by the seashore. That might actually be too much. I might go more into the 2.5, 3 range here. And you can see here as the light blinks, that means it's applying the de-esser a little bit. So maybe 3.5, somewhere like that. She sells seashells by the seashore. Otherwise, it shouldn't be kicking on too much. And that looks about right. Maybe a little bit less. Maybe I'm going to go back down to 3. There we go. We'll kind of work with it there. Again, notice that I have a set of headphones plugged in here. I am monitoring this the whole time. So that's really the key. When you're changing any of these settings, you want to make sure you've got some good headphones on so you can hear what changes are occurring there. All right, next up, we have the enhancer. We have a low frequency detail and a high frequency detail. Let me just read the description here from DBX in the manual. about what these do. So the low frequency detail, low frequency enhancement simultaneously applies an 80 hertz boost and a 250 hertz cut to the program, to the audio that is. This lets you apply substantial bass boost without making the program sound muddy or boomy due to excessive mid-bass boost. So let's go ahead and try applying some of that. And I'm talking into it right now so you can hear what it sounds like. We're getting very, very bassy here. And maybe that's a little too much, but maybe in the 4 range, if you wanted to have that sort of rich broadcast sound, you can apply it just like that. Then the high frequency detail, let's see what they say about that. This control determines the amount of high frequency spectral enhanced signal added to the input signal. Spectral enhancement is a form of dynamic phase and amplitude equalization. Continuous analysis of the input signal intelligently and automatically determines the amount of equalization necessary at each moment to achieve detailed, defined audio that is never shrill or over-sibilant. So this adds a little bit of sheen and clarity, as you can see here as I turn that up, but it's also not supposed to make things sound too sibilant at the same time. So I would say somewhere, since I have a fairly bright voice in some respects, maybe somewhere in that range. Again, it's hard to tell right as I'm talking. It's easier to tell oftentimes when you're listening to the recorded part when you're not talking. So there's that. Next up, we have the expander gate, and this is useful for being able to, I'm going to pull this down again. It looks like we were clipping a little bit there, so I want to pull that back. A little bit, but not too much. Okay. The next, so the expander gate, what's that all about? Well, expander gate, we're not going to use it as a gate. A gate would be something you would use for musical instruments. So for example, a lot of times when engineers are recording drums, they want to be able to make the drums sound very punchy and very clean. So that is to say, when the drummer hits one of the drums, you don't want all of the other mics to also pick that up. So use a gate. And what a gate does is it basically turns that microphone off when it's not getting the signal closest to it, the sound closest to it. So it only opens up the mic of the drum that's actually being hit at the time, is another way of saying that. So the problem is that a gate basically turns the microphone entirely off. An expander does the exact same thing, but it doesn't turn the mic entirely off. It just attenuates it some. In other words, it turns it down a little bit, if you will. So we have 2 settings on that. We have a threshold and we have an expansion ratio. Now, the threshold is the thing that you'll use to tell it when to open up, when to let the audio signal all the way through. And when you're doing spoken word dialogue, that's often going to be somewhere in the maybe minus, let's start here with 30. And you can watch the LEDs. When it's red, it's closed. When it's green, it's open. And then the threshold, what the threshold tells it to do is how much to attenuate when it's closed. Now, let's see, is that really the right setting for us? Let's kind of move this around a little bit. You can see there it wasn't opening it up enough, and I might need to even put it down a little bit more. So there's a little bit cleaner there. So we have, whenever I say something, you should see the green LED. Whenever I stop, you should see the red LED. And that's exactly what we're seeing there. So you have to kind of tune that setting there just to make sure you're not cutting yourself off when you don't want to cut it off, or leave it open all the time like we are there. So there's where it actually closes in between what we're saying, and it opens up whenever we're talking. So there we go. Now the ratio, you can see here, if I push this really hard, when I stop talking, you're basically going to hear nothing. And that can be a little jarring if it's, again, that's fine. That's when you get it into gate territory. That's fine for drums and things like that. But if I want it to sound a little bit more natural, I don't want it to completely shut down. So that's why we kind of fine-tune that setting. And I think for dialogue, a lot of times 2-to-1 is pretty good, maybe up into 3-to-1, but I wouldn't go a whole lot beyond that. And what this is really useful for is, especially if you have multiple of these units because you're recording multiple people, you're basically getting an auto mix in that case. By that, we've talked about auto mix a number of times here on the channel and in some of the courses. But basically what auto mix does is it closes or it attenuates the microphone that's not directly being spoken into at the moment, and that makes things sound a lot cleaner in the overall recording. So this is actually basically doing that with an expander. And then this last setting here is the output. Now, you saw earlier we were getting really too hot and the signal was too loud. And so we needed to turn that output gain down. So the reason that happened was, and you can actually also adjust for it over here as well, but you can see here, even at our input, we're only, kind of hitting between -20 and -10, which is generally a pretty good place to be. Leave yourself plenty of overhead, or headroom, excuse me. And then over here on on the compressor, when you push that drive, you're doing more amplification. And so that's where things can get a little too hot. And that's why we had to drop this down so that our overall signal wasn't getting too hot. And the way you can monitor that is actually on, for example, here I'm doing it on my computer. You can't see it right now, but I've got another meter that's metering the signal coming off of the Apollo that comes out of the DBX. So that's how you can do that. So overall, there's just a quick look at how the dbx286 works under the circumstances under which you might want to use it, and just a first look at setting one up and how that works. I'll obviously need to get some more practice with this and get used to how it works, and then come back to you with more detail, perhaps, on how to get those settings set up. So if you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. If you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And if you haven't checked out our courses over at school.learnlightandsound.com, make sure you do that as well. I'll talk to you again soon.